This is Beyond the Bubble, Alternative Proteins, take 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, kia ora and welcome to Beyond the Bubble. We all remember earlier this year the fallout after Air New Zealand announced that it would start serving the Impossible Burger on some of its flights. That is a plant-based, meatless patty produced in a Silicon Valley lab. Cue reactionary political statements, endless media coverage, and talkback radio lines ringing off the hook. For several days, this completely dominated New Zealand's media cycle. But was this fiasco just about our national carrier deciding to offer a vegetarian option to its passengers, or was it driven by something a little bit deeper than that? If we cast our minds back to last year's election, we saw the issues of water rights, politics of climate change and land usage really come to the fore. And in the PM zone town of Morrinsville, farmers turned out in droves to protest the Labour and Green Party's proposed water and pollution charges. Federated Farmers said at the time that New Zealand is too small to have an urban-rural divide. So, does New Zealand have an issue with the urban-rural divide, and are the politics of climate change and other difficult political decisions driving this? Well, here to discuss these issues with us in more detail, Richard Fowler, dairy farmer from Te Puke and a Nuffield scholar where he researched synthetic food and the implications for New Zealand agriculture. Welcome. We have Melissa Clark-Reynolds, a digital strategist, futurist, entrepreneur, and the first independent non-farmer director of Beef and Lamb New Zealand. And we have John Hart, an organic sheep and beef farmer in the Wairarapa, co-founder of tech outfit Fab Lab, and the Green Party candidate for the Wairarapa seat in the 2017 election. Good morning.
Thanks.
John, if I may start with you, as somebody who splits his time between town and country and also in political circles, what is your take on the so-called urban-rural divide?
Well, I think there is a case to be made that there is an urban-rural divide. A lot of people have said, oh, there's no such thing, we all have the same values, but we are probably now more urban than we've ever been in the history of this country. For me, when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, everyone I knew had access to a farm. They had an auntie or an uncle or a cousin, and you go and spend summer holidays on a farm. So you kind of grew up knowing much more about where your food came from and the ins and outs of food production. These days, I think it's something like 86% of us, Stats New Zealand, classify as being urban. So, as a country, we're sliding more and more towards people living in cities. The gap, if there is one, it's more of an empathy gap, an understanding gap, that people in cities don't really understand the ins and outs of food production. And conversely, people in the rural sector don't give urban people enough credit for wanting to know more. And so you get this kind of gap, and into that gap you can throw misinformation, fear and doubt. And people will believe what they see because they don't necessarily know any better.
You spend a lot of time between town and country as well, don't you, Melissa? What's your take on this? Is this something that farmers are talking about a lot in your dealings with them?
I think farmers are talking about it a lot, and I think if you look at the last election, we did kind of vote along urban-rural lines as well. In New Zealand, we're all pretty much in the centre, the difference between the National Party and the Labour Party is not huge actually, so it's not like we've got this massive divide, but we do see that the rural electorates tend to vote National and the urban electorates tend to vote Labour. And so you can see a divide in there. What I also saw recently is that with the Agri Women's Development Trust, which I'm deeply involved with, we organised some lunches recently with 20 urban women and 20 farming women. If we just got women together to talk about food and to talk about their businesses and talk about farming, how that might go. And yet from the urban women's point of view, they were buying food. The food that was produced by these women farmers, it really mattered to them where that food came from, what they were feeding their children, whether there was, glyphosate residue in it, and things that I think the farming women didn't really, they're just running a business. And they were shocked, actually, I think, by how much of an opinion the urban women had. What was great about these lunches, though, was that we still realised we did have the same values around family, we had the same values around environment, but actually there were gaps as well.
Sure. Richard, at last year's protest in Morrinsville, the Federated Farmers spokesperson said that even vegans need farmers. Do you think that it is fundamentally about a clash of values and misunderstanding?
Yeah, ultimately it's true, everyone does need food at the end of the day, I suppose. So New Zealand's a bit unique. Like John said, 86% of people class themselves as urban now. That's actually not too bad compared to some countries, like in the States now I think 2% of the population produce all the food. So relatively, with maybe it's a thing, it's going on, but where I think New Zealand is a bit unique is that we export so much food, so the population doesn't necessarily see all the benefits of that food that's being produced. And the other thing is too that farmers ultimately manage, or have done in the past, rightly or wrongly, manage public resources for private good, I guess, and I think there's starting to be a bit more pushback around that. Now we're getting these environmental issues and the public's sort of saying, hang on a minute, you know, I'm driving past this stream that doesn't look swimmable, I want to have a say in how that's managed, and I think those are the sort of things we're getting into now. So,
I'd just like to bring up the issue of social licence. When we hear about agriculture making up half of New Zealand's emissions, and we see in the newspaper about polluted rivers and political slogans wanting to fix that. Is it fundamentally a case of social licence in the respect that farmers may have lost some sort of PR battle with the urban public?
To be fair, you know, it's been a brutal couple of weeks to be in the rural sector. You know, we've had, whether it's stories about climate, or stories about water, or stories about fetal blood collection, or stories about M. bovis, or stories about feedlots. You know, the last 2 weeks, I have to say, has probably been the toughest time that I've had trying to straddle that urban-rural divide. I think urban New Zealanders are getting increasingly concerned about the things that Richard talked about. You know, I used to be able to see a waterhole, strip off, get in, and now you've kind of got to think, well, can I? And that change in one generation is probably, I think water is actually a much bigger issue for most urban New Zealanders than climate even. Climate's a little ephemeral, but that ability of whether or not I can swim. And so when we think about losing social licence, I would say that most New Zealanders are not thinking farming generally. They are mostly, I think, thinking water and climate.
Right. I mean, John, you're an organic beef and sheep farmer. Do you find that sort of gives you a little bit more cred in certain circles?
I'd be the first to admit that organic is not the solution. It's possibly one slice of the pie in terms of sustainable agriculture. It doesn't necessarily make you a better farmer. It's just a different way of farming. But picking up on Melissa's point, I think it's kind of a surprise that people get when they get a look under the covers, and it's sort of there's a shocking moment where people have this image of farming in a certain way, and you know, arguably we're to blame because we advertise rolling green hills and beautiful emerald grass and happy cows, and that's what urban people see as the image of New Zealand farming, and that's what we sell to export our products. You know, there was an example last year when the footage of the bobby calf treatment came out, and people were absolutely shocked at what they saw as cruelty to the animals. And there was a quote at the time from a Federated Farmers spokesperson who said, well, this is just the reality of farming. And it was that moment of disconnect where people have that kind of, oh, I've looked under the covers and that's not what I thought it was going to be. Yeah. Those moments are happening more and more and closer together. And I think it builds to a point where the social licence is starting to be at risk.
Part of what we're seeing as a cultural trend globally is transparency. And so as we get more and more transparency, people start to go, ugh, you know, whether it's bobby calves, you know, Glenn Herod is a lovely farmer down in the South Island, dairy farmer who had the happy cow, who was really trying to keep his calves on and struggled to make money, not killing the bobbies, you know, keeping them with the mother and sharing the milk. And that's a very difficult business model to be able to run. And so I think most milk drinkers don't really have in their minds, oh yeah, I'm actually taking milk from a baby. You know what I mean? Like this milk has been produced for a calf. Where did the calf go? And so some of those things, as they become more transparent, we have to expect there to be pushback against them.
We're probably always going to have some sort of rivalry between townies and people in the country and farmers. But is there any way that we can start bridging the gap and stop it from becoming this toxic issue? Richard, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, harking back to the whole public resource thing, I think we're heading down that process now, and I think the challenge is that the whole public's got to take responsibility for setting guidelines, I suppose, limits around those public resources, and then the other challenges the farmers have got to let go of that a wee bit, which they've had full control of in the past. Yeah, I'd say the challenge is full engagement for everyone, taking responsibility for actually managing those resources, because to me that's where a lot of the rub is again.
Great. All right, we're just going to take a quick break then. We'll be back with part 2 very shortly.